BBC announcer. What is it that draws people like Mr. A to this way of life? Psychiatrist. Most normal adolescents go through this phase. Some are almost certainly attracted by its very illegality. The same with murder. Make it illegal, and it acquires a mystique. Look at arson. I mean, who can honestly say he's never set fire to some great public building? I know I have. That's a quote from Monty Python's Flying Circus. The good world for the LI was like heaven for the Cathars, a world where, quote, the sacred was only the social transfigured, end of quote. It was what in the 1930s Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin called carnivalization, a way of being in the world that laughed away all that is finished and polished, all pomposity, every ready-made solution in the sphere of thought and world outlook. How to get there was the subject of rational embellishments to the city of Paris. Potlatch, number 23, 13 October 1955. It began as a scholastic revision of an old surrealist paper, Breton's 1933 experimental researches on the irrational embellishment of a city. Breton proposed a trade-off between spectacles, Notre Dame, replaced the towers with an enormous glass cruet, one of the bottles filled with blood, the other with semen. The LI was looking for an institutionalized disruption of everyday life, for Rimbaud's rational disordering of the senses, as a practical account of the errand, the appointment, the commute, the purchase. The LI leaped over Breton and back to the spirit of what is Dadaism and what does it want in Germany. In the LI's new civilization, the practical would be a question of the longest distance between 2 points. The LI's Ministry of Leisure was issuing its first decrees. Open the metro at night after the trains stop running. Keep the corridors and tunnels poorly lit by means of weak, intermittently functioning lights. With a careful rearrangement of fire escapes and the creation of walkways where needed, open the roofs of Paris for strolling. Leave the public gardens open at night. Keep them dark. In some cases, a weak illumination may be justified by psychogeographical considerations. Put switches on the street lamps so lighting will be under public control. The ministry moved on to the churches. 4 different solutions were advanced and recognized as legitimate until they can be tested by experiment, when the best idea will win out. G.E. Debord declares himself in favor of the total destruction of religious buildings of every faith. No trace would remain, and the spaces would be used for other purposes. Gil J. Woolman proposes that churches be preserved but emptied of all religious significance. They should be treated as ordinary buildings. Let children play in them. Michel Bernstein insists that churches be partially destroyed so that the remaining ruins would reveal nothing of their original purposes. The perfect solution would be to raze the churches and reconstruct ruins in their places. The first of these 2 solutions is proposed simply for the sake of expediency. Lastly, Jacques Villon wants to turn the churches into haunted houses, use their current ambiances, accentuating the panic-instilling aspects. Having completed Michel Moore's interrupted sermon, the group went back to the secular. Keep the railroad stations as they are. Their rather moving ugliness greatly adds to the atmosphere of travel, which provides what slight attraction these buildings possess. Gil J. Woolman demanded the complete suppression of falsification of all information about departures, destinations, schedules, etc. This would encourage the dérive. After lively debate, the opposition backed down and the project was adopted without dissent. Accentuate the aural ambience of the stations by broadcasting arrival and departure information originating from numerous other stations and from various ports. Suppression of the cemeteries, total destruction of corpses and all tombstones. No ashes, not a trace shall remain. Attention must be drawn to the reactionary propaganda which, through the most elementary association of ideas, this hideous survival of past alienation represents. Abolition of the museums and the redistribution of masterpieces in bars. Put the work of Philippe de Champagne in the Arab cafes in the Rue Xavier Privis. Put David Soch in the Tanu in Rue Montague, Genevieve. Free and unlimited access to the prisons for everyone. Allow people to use them for vacations. No discrimination between visitors and prisoners. To add to the fun, monthly lotteries would be held to pick visitors to be sentenced to actual jail terms. In The Role of Writing, also in Potlatch number 23, the LI had already proposed the subversion of various streets by means of graffiti specifically appropriate to them. Quote, if we don't die here, will we go farther? End of quote. For Rue Sauvage. For Rue Le Monde, quote, give it the benefit of the doubt, end of quote. Now it affirmed the possibilities of creating civic confusion by the détournement of inscriptions on statues and monuments. It proposed an end to the cretinization of the public by various sorts of street names, announcing the erasure of all markers honoring municipal officials, heroes of the resistance, all those bearing words plainly, quote, vile, e.g. Rue de l'Evangile, end of quote. All those carrying the names Emile and Edouard, and, quote, what's interesting about this, said a friend of mine after looking over the LI's directives, is how half of it remained a pipe dream and how half of it came true. What do you mean, I said, thinking of Bob Ackerman's 3-day vacation in a Nazi prison camp. Doesn't this remind you of anything? The graffiti, the gardens open at night, the lights flickering, people walking on roofs, streets with new names, all the transportation information completely scrambled. For a moment, really, it seemed as if the prisons would be open. The chapel in the Sorbonne was almost razed. There was even a leaflet demanding that Cardinal Richelieu be dug up and his bones tossed in the street. Of course, there were new inscriptions on the statues. Probably the last thing to happen would have been taking the paintings out of the Louvre. It's easier to kill God than art. You see what I'm getting at? What are you getting at? I said, thinking of Johnny Rotten singing Give the Wrong Time, Stop a Traffic Line as a route to anarchy in the UK, about the weird split between the absolute demands in his voice and the triviality of his advice on how to realize them. My friend had been to school in Paris. He was just remembering what it was like. This is what happened in May 68, he said. Another version of the LI's rational embellishments happened at the University of Strasbourg in the fall of '66. It was a small event, a series of student pranks, a sort of negationist panty raid, or as a typical newspaper editorial put it at the time, perhaps the first concrete manifestation of a revolt aiming quite openly at the destruction of society. A panty raid is the end of the world. That was the reversible connecting factor, if anything was. There were 3 planes on which the imaginary revolution in the Strasbourg laboratory took place. The artistic plane of a work called The Return of the Durruti Column, the literary plane of a text called On the Poverty of Student Life, and the tactical plane of the events that followed and the response they provoked. But in outline, the story was simple. Bored with their classes and disgusted by the pettiness of left-wing youth group politics, in the spring of '66, 5 students proclaimed their desire to see the government-sanctioned student union ruined, stood for election to its offices, and amidst the overwhelming apathy of their peers found themselves voted in to run the show. During the summer break, friends of the surprised winners made contact with the SI through its post office box in Paris, the only way the group made contact with anyone, and asked for a meeting. We have a piece of power, they said. We want to wreck it. If you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Scoop Nisker, radio sign-off, KSAN-FM, San Francisco, 1969. By 1957, a search for purity in motive and deed brought the Letrist International to a state of immobilization, where there were only motives and no deeds. That was why the LI had to merge with others less pure, to take one step back. By 1966, the Situationist International reached the same pass. The Situationist project had taken on its definitive form, Christopher Gray wrote in 1974 in Leaving the 20th Century. The SI was to be a small, tightly knit group of revolutionaries devoted to forging a critique of contemporary, that is to say, consumer capitalism, and to publicizing this critique by every form of scandal and agitation possible. Everything depended on universal insurrection. Poetry could only be made by everyone. But the group had all but left the public space. The scandals it made took place only in its journal, with one-time allies like Henry Lefebvre spurned as impostors or thieves. With all the practicing painters and architects of the early SI years gone, some like Jorn resigned, the rest excluded. With anti-art exhibitions and plans to build new cities, or failing that, to seize museums, even the headquarters of UNESCO. Repudiated or forgotten, the SI had turned to a close reading of other people's gestures of refusal, their protests, riots, wildcat strikes, their acts of random violence. Though it was a reading of increasing empathy and excitement, sometimes perceiving the ideas in other people's minds far more completely than those people did themselves, coming off the page as a real conversation between actors and thinkers. It was, of course, a fabulous conversation, beginning in a refusal of art and now seeking its realization in events. Even as the conversation expanded to take in the whole world, the news everyone talked about, and the news no one but the speakers noticed, it became ever more aesthetic, a theory devouring its evidence. As they approached the climax of their story, the situationists were of the world, but not in it. Quote, what they had gained in intellectual power and scope, Gray wrote in a leaving draft he did not publish, they had lost, or so it seems to me, in terms of the richness and verve of their own everyday lives. Numbers were drastically reduced. Their organization was no longer meaningfully international. It was Parisian. There was no longer any of their previous experimentation with architecture or living space. Cultural sabotage, too, went by the board. They were permanently broke. The group turned inwards. There was little or nothing that didn't seem reformist. Everything went into the perfecting of their analyses, into the savagery of their anti-philosophy, into their magazine. The drunken tearaway exuberance of their lecherous days was replaced by living up to the role of an incredibly austere rejection of everything apart from rejection. End of quote. The Strasbourg students offered the SI a chance to go back to the world. We want to cause trouble, the students said, as much as we can. How? Do it yourself, the SI said, reminding them of something Debord had written years before. Quote, a revolutionary organization must always remember that its objective is not getting people to listen to speeches by expert leaders, but getting them to speak for themselves, end of quote. You want to make trouble? Understand that just as everyday life is right here, in the successes and failures of our conversation, so are the premises for revolution. Revolution is not something that happens on the other side of the world, in China, Vietnam, Cuba. For you and for us, that is just intellectual tourism. And as an opposition to the spectacle, it can produce only a spectacle of opposition. So think globally, but act locally. Use the funds your fellows have so imprudently entrusted to your care. Use the platform you've landed on. Write a critique of your own status, of students and the society they represent and serve. Serve even when they flatter themselves they are its enemies. Disseminate your critique and see what happens. If it is strong enough, something will. Use each edge of whatever scandal you can cause as a leg up on the next step. When one barrier breaks, go through it and move on. Remember that though you are risking the career society has planned for you, there is no protection in compromise. That the success of a scandal is the only safeguard for those who trigger it. That those who make a revolution by halves only dig their own graves. The students went back to Strasbourg. The fall term began.